everyone. I'm Lucy Suchman, the current president of For Us, and now you know how my last name is spelled, if you've never heard it before, how it's pronounced. So I'm very glad to see you all here today for this opening plenary. So I'm going to begin by reading you a bit of a story. In The Power of Maps, cartographer Dennis Wood quotes from a tale of two children named Big Tiger and Christian who travel together through the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. So here's how it goes. Big Tiger had never had a map in his hand before, but he pretended to know all about maps and remarked airily, "I can't read the names on this one because they're in English." Christian realized he would have to show his friend how to read a map. "The top is north," he said. "The little circles are towns and villages. Blue means rivers and lakes. The thin lines are roads, and the thick ones, railways." "There's nothing at all here," said Big Tiger, pointing to one of the many white patches. "That means it's just desert," Christian explained. "You have to go into the desert to know what it looks like." So this exchange provides an opening parable for our gathering here under the theme of STS insensibilities. Whose knowledges are presupposed in specific renderings of the world? Where and how are those knowledges located? What literacies are implied? And through what histories and relations do they come to have their authority? Where are the white spaces? Who draws them as such? And how are those empty spaces in the accounts of some known and lived by others who inhabit them? Dennis Wood continues, "As long as the map is accepted as a window on the world, these lines must be accepted as representing things in it, with the ontological status of streams and hills. But no sooner are maps acknowledged as social constructions than their contingent, their conditional characters unveiled. Suddenly, the things represented by these lines are open to discussion and debate. The interests in them are made apparent. In Maps or Territories, Science is an Atlas. David Turnbull and Helen Watson-Varon build on the argument, now well established within STS, that Western science has acquired its power in part through denying or rendering invisible the inherent indexicality of its knowledge claims. The work of STS scholarship includes recovery of the connections, including the culturally and historically specific material practices, social relations, imaginaries, methods, and interests that inform the sensibilities of the technosciences in an attempt to comprehend not only their efficacy, but also their limits. This year's conference theme invites an open reading and exploration of how the world is made multiply sensible through specific discourses and practices of knowledge-making, including that which evades the sensorium of technoscience and of STS. It could be argued that for many in the contemporary moment, sensing has become something of an obsession. At the same time that STS scholars refigure the boundaries between technology and society, facts and values, nature and culture, as the mutual constitutions, co-productions, and entanglements of which we're all part, the technoscientific apparatus becomes ever more dominated by data. From built environments to oceans and atmospheres, those of us in the hyper-developed world inhabit an increasingly computationally enabled sensorium. The effects of this apparatus are differentially beneficial to some, harmful to others. My hope for the conference theme was that the sense of sensing would be read broadly by those who responded, and in reading through the program, I'm gratified to see the many ways in which the questions posed in the call have been taken up, and also happy that, as ever, you felt free to ignore them in favor of topics of your own. Of those who have engaged the theme, I see that many of you have taken up the question of how technoscientific imaginaries and evidentiary practices make sense, and how, an increasingly urgent concern, we engage with the performative power of nonsense and the systematic manufacture of ignorance. As you're all too well aware, we come together at a moment of troubling developments across the human and more than human worlds. Among those is a renewed repression of voices challenging to entrenched interests, including the voices of scientists committed to speaking inconvenient truths to power. In the face of these troubles, 4S has joined with sister societies internationally to reaffirm the importance of evidence-based knowledge-making practices in the humanities, social, and technosciences, and of the freedom of scholars and activists to speak, travel, and assemble. Thanks to all of you who made the journey here, particularly across US borders. Now, if I were another president, I would claim that this was the largest demonstration ever staged at Logan International Airport. But instead, I'll simply say thank you to the stalwart company who came together for this symbolic statement of welcome and opposition to US border policies, and also thanks to Nadia Peak, who made these wonderful placards for us. I'd like to take a moment as well to thank those past 4S presidents who are here at 4S 2017 and who've given so much to the society. We're grateful that they're with us now and for all that they've done before. They are Karen Norsatina, Sheila Jazanov, Michael Lynch, Judy Wiseman, Trevor Pinch, and Gary Downey. Thanks as well to our incoming president, Kim Fortune, who, as you'll see over the coming days, is very much already in position. I'll be doing many more thanks in the coming days, but there's just one more person who needs to be acknowledged now, and then many times again, and that is our program chair extraordinaire, Heather Paxson. Our opening plenary addresses the question of how we might bring STS sensibilities to bear on critical analyses of prevailing figures of the threat to collective well-being. The session arises from a growing awareness that the received terms that we have with which to articulate concern, threat, risk, crisis, and the like, effectively work to hold in place the very things that we might want to change. How can we challenge the dominant framings of what we should be concerned about and develop generative reframings that can help us find new spaces for thought and action? A crucial starting place is to problematize who in any specific statement is assumed as the we that comprises our collective, and what historical violence and continuing injustice that presumed unity obscures. A related move is a lateral one. Following Anat Singh's advice in The Mushroom at the End of the World, quote, to look around rather than ahead, as she puts it, to notice what's missed at the margins of dominant social worlds and their narratives. My anticipation is that our panelists this evening will follow that advice in weaving together troubling histories and presence of settler colonialism, racialized identification and difference, borders and belonging, biopolitics and health, insecurity and militarism as part of thinking and acting our way into new possibilities. My own engagement with critical scholarship in the service of anti-militarism examines how military power regenerates the injuries to which it claims to respond and how it could be otherwise. As cultural geographer Derek Gregory argues, quote, the architecture of enmity is produced and set to work through a repertoire of practices that have performative force. To blunt that force and deflect its violence requires, among other things, an analysis of the dispersed construction sites where the architecture of enmity is put in place and put into practice. End of the quote. A central repertoire within that architecture is, of course, the production of identification and difference, us and them, a concern that I believe will run through our panel today. That concern informs my current work on a particular construction site in the US architecture of enmity, that is, the use of simulation as a basis for military training. My focus is on whose knowledges and interests inform the figuration of US theaters of operation and military training simulations, on the premise that training is less about recognition of what is out there than it is generative of imaginaries that are transported and realized in sites of deployment. These are regimes of identification that, in the words of Judith Butler, operate to produce certain subjects as recognizable persons and to make others decidedly more difficult to recognize. This work has strong resonance with Ahmad Mcharak's attention to what she and her colleagues have characterized as the phenotypic other, a figure central not only to war, but also, and increasingly, to management of borders of the homeland. One generative strategy from STS is to undo the power of ruling knowledge systems through accounts of the irremediably messy contingencies of the actual practices on which they rest and which their stories systematically erase. As Donald Mackenzie observed regarding the development of nuclear weapons in his book Inventing Accuracy, quote, "To see the mundane social processes that form the world is to see simultaneously the possibility of intervening in them, of reshaping that world," end quote. I'm delighted to be joined in this reshaping effort today by 4 outstanding STS scholars, who I'll introduce in the order in which I've asked them to speak. Kim Tallbear is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience, and Environment. Working at the intersection of race, genomics, and identification, in cases where identification matters for a mix of legal, practical, spiritual, and political concerns, Kim is the author of Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging, and the False Promise of Genetic Science, published in 2013. Her work insists on attention to the marks that bodies, those of genetic scientists as well as Native American subjects, carry within collective colonial histories as an inseparable constituent of knowledge practices. Most recently, her Indigenous STS work has turned to questions of decolonial and Indigenous sexualities. Building on lessons learned with geneticists about how race categories get settled, Kim is working on a book that interrogates settler colonial commitments to settlement in place, within disciplines, and within monogamous state-sanctioned marriage. She is a citizen of the Sistan Wapton Oyate in South Dakota. Ahmad Mcharak is Professor of Anthropology of Science at the University of Amsterdam. Her research interests are in biomedical practices and, like Kim, in how those practices render human biological and genetic variation in relation to race and to wider frames of identification and belonging. Ahmad is known to many of us for her laboratory ethnography of human genetic diversity, published in 2005 as the Human Genome Diversity Project, an ethnography of scientific practice. Ahmad's subsequent work has focused on face-making and race-making in forensic identification and extends to her current examination of the forensics of refugee migrants in the Mediterranean. In Topologies of Race, published in Science, Technology, and Human Values, Ahmad and her co-authors emphasize the inseparability of the corporeal and the digital, attending to the entwining of databases and embodied visualities, and to the border as a site for the reproduction of racialized differences and inequalities. Steve Epstein is a professor of sociology and the humanities at Northwestern University. His work examines the contested production of expert and especially biomedical knowledge, with an emphasis on the interplay of social movements, experts, and health institutions, and with a focus on the politics of sexuality, gender, and race. He is best known within the STS community for 2 outstanding books, Impure Science, AIDS, Activism, and the Politics of Knowledge, which won Forrest's Rachel Carson Prize in 1999, and Inclusion, The Politics of Difference in Medical Research, which won Forrest's Fleck Prize in 2009. In his current work, Steve looks at the proliferation of the modern concept of sexual health, examining the intersections of neoliberal mandates of individual responsibility to be healthy and the medicalization and associated sanitization of sexuality. His consistent touchstone through all of his work has been an insistence on attention to the specificities and politics of difference as they're expressed at the intersections of health and medicine, and the transformative power of passionate, critical, and collective engagements with technoscience. Joe Masco traces the connecting thread of what he has identified as an infectious insecurity, tying the threat of disease to other forms of insecurity since the Cold War. Joe's distinctive combination of creative, historical, and ethnographic scholarship has been expressed most fully in two books: The Nuclear Borderlands, The Manhattan Project in Post-Cold War New Mexico, which won the 2008 Rachel Carson Prize from the 4S, and more recently, The Theater of Operations, National Security Affect from the Cold War to the War on Terror, published in 2014. His current work focuses, in his words, quote, on conceptualizations of existential danger, attending to the intersections of technological revolution, slow and fast violence, and emerging planetary modes of governance. Many of you will notice an absence on our panel, as Karen Barad, who had planned to be with us, was very regretfully unable to do so. I'd like to bring in her voice, at least momentarily, to get us started. In a forthcoming article titled Troubling Times and Ecologies of Nothingness, Returning, Remembering, and Facing the Incalculable, Karen begins with reflection on the doomsday clock of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, introduced in 1947 to represent scientists' estimation of our proximity to the global catastrophe of nuclear war, and recalibrated in 2007 to include the threat of climate change. Quote, "This is a rather strange clock," Karen observes, "a non-mechanical, symbolic clock, a bit of sincere theatrics that is an expression of the scientific community's estimation of global precarity in the present," end quote. Clock time, she points out, is the homogeneous time of capitalism, colonialism, and militarism. In her paper, she thinks indigenous conceptions of time and history more multiple, spatial, and place-based than singular and linear, together with quantum temporality, not to absorb the former into the latter, but to articulate the help that both provide in thinking through or away from hegemonies of homogeneous time. Quote, "In these troubling times," she writes, "the urgency to trouble time, to shake it to its core, and to produce collective imaginaries that undo pervasive conceptions of temporality, that take progress as inevitable and the past as something that has passed and is no longer with us, is something so tangible, so visceral, that it can be felt in our individual and collective bodies," end quote. And it's in that spirit that our panel proceeds. So I would love to invite Kim to come up.
I'm just going to put my time on. That'd be great, thanks. Hi. So, for those of you that know my work, it focuses on science and technology and the politics of nature and sexuality broadly. But I gaze upon those concepts as they are integral to genocidal settlement. How do science, engineering, environmental, and social policy support extracting and stewarding natural and human resources to maintain empire and eliminate indigenous peoples? In The White Possessive, Property, Power, and Indigenous Sovereignty, Aileen Morton Robinson clarifies how the dispossession of Native Americans was integral to the project of nation building. The resources used to build this state include not only lands and waters, but indigenous bodies and those of our non-human relatives. Next slide. Genomics and its antecedent fields loom large for me. They are central to constructing national narratives of indigeneity, narratives that presume we are vanished and then end up confirming that assumption according to biologically fetishistic criteria and notions of purity. The stories that genomicists, anthropologists, and their publics tell about us do not square with indigenous peoples' own will to self-determination, our resistance to state assimilation. Now, indigeneity is a concept that only makes sense with the coming of the settler, but it paradoxically helps constitute a global network for anti-colonial organizing that enables our survival as distinct peoples. Yet, the United States is a vast land of indigenous erasure. As a Dakota who travels the world and recently emigrated, I have a good vantage point from which to gaze upon this national space of erasure. Indigenous people are the unseen ghosts who haunt the nights of Americans for centuries. We make things move in the house of this country, but Americans deny we are here when they mostly forget to name or reference us, or when they do, it is as artifacts of a waning time. They like to claim us as ancestors, even absent supporting data, and they like to wear us in caricature as sports mascots. But if contemporary topics such as Charlottesville or the Trump-North Korea spat are at play, Indigenous interests go unspoken. The noises we make shrugged off as the house settling. I got tired of being a ghost, so I moved to Canada, which is not nearly far enough away. But Indigenous peoples are more seen in Canada, which is not all for the good. The red-white race dividing line is far more prominent in the upper latitudes, and with that comes more explicit forms of anti-Indigenous racism. Morton Robinson shows that even progressive thinkers who link race, nation, class, immigration, and global capitalism fail to include indigeneity when critical analyses of U.S. empire are made. So pay attention as you listen to 4S talks. How many will critique this moment and imperialistic moments that led to here, and the role of technoscience in that without mentioning settler colonialism? Why are even anti-racist progressives relentlessly silent on Indigenous dispossession? Morton Robinson explains. The conceptual links between the privileges and benefits that flow from American citizenship to Native American dispossession remain invisible. Instead, slavery, war, and migration are the narratives by which the historically contingent positionality of whiteness unfolds. So whiteness and its constitutive white-black binary are analyzed and critiqued sufficiently in many minds without needing to recognize Indigenous dispossession. Morton Robinson surmises, perhaps the selective historical amnesia displayed is partly the result of scholars not being epistemologically and ontologically open to being a disoriented, displaced, and diasporic racialized subject whose existence within the nation-state is predicated on the continuing divestment of Indigenous peoples' sovereign rights. Next slide. Last November, just days after the election, Neil McKay, Spirit Lake, Oyate, and University of Minnesota Dakota language instructor opened the American Anthropological Association meeting in Minneapolis with a Dakota welcome. You can imagine the mood of that space last November. But McKay reminded the audience that our Dakota perspective is a little bit different. He spoke of treaties between the Dakota and the US, all violated by the Americans. In fact, Abraham Lincoln presided over the Dakota apocalypse when it happened. McKay reminded the audience of thousands of anthropologists, we are still here, and this is Dakota land you are illegally occupying. Still, he welcomed people to our home territory, just as our ancestors had welcomed 19th century newcomers. Our ancestors had attempted diplomacy through kin-making before the Dakota-US War of 1862, but settlers make terrible kin. Neil McKay's overall point was ongoing threat and crisis. He refused to lament Trump's election as a new kind of nightmare. McKay's foundational grounding and mine is that of ongoing crisis, risk and threat that we endure. It is US-American occupation of this land that is the risk we endure. For the world, it is destructive colonial nation-building period. So whose traditional territory do we occupy here, and what became Massachusetts? When I lived in Boston 24 years ago, I worked for the Wampanoag, the Narragansett, and a half dozen other Indigenous peoples in so-called New England. You probably don't think about it this way, but Indigenous peoples in these lands have been living post-apocalyptically for centuries. For some Indigenous peoples, their apocalypse is underway. The bureaucratic papers signed, military aggressions funded, and extractive industries permitted by the politicians even you voted for. The sound of Neil McKay's footsteps still echoed on stage when the next speaker, an anthropologist, took the microphone. She spoke of this new and terrifying moment, of regressed American democracy, of needing to rally together in progressive action to recover what has been lost. Even when Indigenous people are heard, we are not heard. Next slide. At an ontological level, Morton Robinson explains, the structure of subjective possession occurs through the imposition, oh, my stuff's gone, through the imposition of one's will to be on the thing that is perceived to lack will. Thus, it is open to being possessed. Of course, Indigenous peoples are often perceived as being close to nature, and Morton Robinson points out that being perceived as living in a state of nature relegates one's existence to being an inseparable part of nature, and therefore incapable of possessing it. So what does that mean? Well, it deanimates other than human persons, for one, and it also means that Indigenous people are therefore possessed and stewarded like those persons, the non-human animals, the land, the water. We Indigenous people are viewed as less animate than the modern citizenry, always past tense, vanishing. But wait, indigeneity is preserved at the brink of death through genetic ancestry claims, by scientists' claims to our biologicals, to our histories, cultural patrimony, the take-up of racist Redskins and other Indian mascot caricatures, all claims by the good citizens to our identities. Representational appropriation, like that of land, water, and DNA, is nationalist possessiveness. Next slide. On August 16, 2017, at a candlelight vigil in Charlottesville, a crowd of thousands sang Woody Guthrie's "This Land is My Land," the complete lyrics of which are more radical than such moments of multicultural nationalism convey. Still, the complete lyrics no less erase Indigenous people than did that moment in Charlottesville. Anti-racist discourse focuses on exclusions that mostly do not call into question the possibility of U.S. coherence. Indigenous Twitterati around the world lamented the song that night. My co-parent is on faculty at the University of Virginia. He and our teenage daughter were in Charlottesville for the protests, and they continue to support anti-racist efforts there. From afar, I do too. But I can no longer be silent when nation building, even this kind, seems to assume Indigenous peoples are long ossified in the grave. I simply do not know what else people are thinking in their silence about us. What else are they thinking? Can they be thinking? Next slide. So let me go back to another example of Indigenous erasure post-election. On November 17, 2016, Cornel West wrote in The Guardian that we must, quote, build multiracial alliances to combat poverty and xenophobia, Wall Street crimes and war crimes, global warming and police abuse, and to protect precious rights and liberties, we must be a hope, a participant, and a force for good as we face this catastrophe. Dr. West also spoke of our democracy slipping away, and in his recognition of the many diverse peoples in the U.S. and abroad done wrong by U.S. neoliberalism, not once did he reflect on Indigenous people. Though Indigenous dispossession is fundamental to providing the literal ground upon which he lamented democratic loss. And he had just visited Standing Rock. Even when people see us, they don't see us. Standing Rock broke my heart anew. The camps gave me more hope than I have ever felt. Then I watched militarized police bring in tanks and big guns to face down Oceti Sakowin people and our allies, water protectors who were nonviolent, who were praying. I glimpsed just a bit of what my ancestors must have felt in that time of starvation, war, environmental rape, and massacre that was 1862, that was 1890, that was 2016, that is U.S. settlement. Our hearts were broken long before Trump. You can go that. Yeah, I'm sorry, you can't. We had a problem with the slides, so you can't see the text and the title, which is that we need a new narrative, and so that's what I'm going to close with. If one refuses Indigenous elimination and the deanimating possession of us, then a new redemptive narrative is required. If we are to live together in a good way here as relations with reciprocal responsibilities to one another and to our other than human relatives with whose bodies we are co-constituted, then the American dream in any form cannot be our guiding hope. If humans are to make good relations on this continent, then these lands and waters and their beings must be the targets of our love, not the state. To dream of U.S. redemption is to sustain that fundamental condition of U.S. existence, ongoing Indigenous elimination. a genocide that is simultaneously human and other than human, and which has proceeded apace in the so-called Americas for 525 years and counting. Can we not turn our eyes away from American exceptionalism and so-called progress toward another kind of story? Might we practice small acts of visionary resistance, narrative, and ontological revision? I stand with Cornel West and Multiracial Alliance. But even more, I stand with relatives, both human and other than human, who continue to suffer across this planet under any administration from the violence that is this American dream. Thank you.
Hello. I should warn you because I changed my presentation this morning, so it's a bit sketchy, but let's see. So in my intervention, I really won't be contributing too much to our understanding of the threat, and rather focus on the possibility to attend to matters of concern differently. So the issue I will talk about today is indeed a threat in many ways, and it is a different threat to different kinds of people. We are talking about what has come to be known as the refugee crisis. Slide. Thank you. Here on this slightly old map, you can see that the largest number of migrants and refugees will cross the Mediterranean basins, which is the deadliest crossing in the world. And after the so-called Turkey deal, which has helped to close the Eastern European border for refugees, the Mediterranean Sea has become virtually the only option left, leading to the death of many people. And although it is called the refugee crisis, there is nothing crisis-like about this humanitarian disaster. The refugee crisis is chronic and it is here to stay. Slide. This causes panic for many, especially for European politicians. Slide. So we see Italy trying to make deals with Libyan officials, whoever those may be, causing the Libyan coast guards to act and open international waters, threatening to take down search and rescue NGO boats who are there to help people at sea, and threatening to take them down if they don't return to Europe, so these NGO boats. Slide. We also see many negotiations with Tunisia in the hope to make another Turkey-like deal whereby Tunisia would become the final destination for sub-Sahara and other migrants. And slide. We see negotiations with Niger, where the goal is to build a wall, and walls are fashionable these days. So to build a wall to keep the migrants in the desert. The violence and racist baseline of such solutions are often silenced and do hardly get articulated. Slide. But recently, in July, a ship, the Sea Star, which was chartered by the extreme right-wing French Génération Identitaire, to protest on open sea. And the goal of Sea Star, as you can see there, is to defend Europe by blocking migrants from docking in European ports or forcing them to turn back to Libya. Slide. But I was pleasantly surprised that in the small southern Tunisian town Zarzis, which is originally my hometown, and also the town where I now conduct my research, the fishermen responded swiftly. The fishermen with whom I work together protested the racism and did not allow Sea Star to enter the Zarzis harbor for refuel. Neither refuel for the boat nor for the right-wing activists. As you can see, no gasoline, no agua, no mangiare. So this is just to put the threat out there. Now my research is mostly about the management of bodies of the thousands of people that do not make it to Europe and that drown in the Mediterranean Sea. Although the dead are counted and sometimes listed, as you can see here, there is little effort to find out about who they are. and there are some recent exceptions there, such as in Italy, where I conduct part of my research as well. So I was wondering, who are these people who die by the thousands? And this year we have already reached the 3,000. And where do they go? Where do they end up, and how? I started to look into the management of bodies and the initiatives to identify them. I focus on what I call emergent forensic infrastructures. So infrastructures that are not nicely chained or ordered, where surprising actors such as fishermen come to play a key role, contributing to the reinvention of forensics and its aims. Often this aim is not so much about identification, actually hardly of it, but simply aimed at taking account of what has happened, the work of paying attention, and I will come back to that. My most recent field site is indeed South Tunisia, the neighboring country of Libya, and because it is so close to Libya, and because of the currents in the bay, many people who drown would either wash up in Libya or in the south of Tunisia, in Zarzis. In my research, I became particularly interested in fishermen and their knowledge of the sea, the weather, the current, of traffic, bodies and their velocities in water, but also the behavior of fish in relation to bodies. And I was wondering whether and how their knowledge, as well as that of an array of other actors, would become part of forensic infrastructures. Fishermen such as Salahuddin Msherik, he's indeed a relative of mine, he's a cousin, are called first responders. And Salah, whom you see here, has rescued more than thousands of people, men, women, and children, and has taken them as well as numerous dead bodies on board of his ship to bring them to the mainland. Slide. So the research is part of a larger project that Lucy had mentioned at the beginning, the Race Face ID project, which is a project on forensics in the criminal justice system, and in which we are interested in the giving of face to unknown persons, suspects, and victims of crime. The project is examining how the giving of a face, so aimed at the individuality, goes hand in hand with the doing of race, which is aimed at the collective. But what happened to race, I wondered, if we would move these and related technologies of identification from the criminal justice system to a humanitarian setting, such as the identification of bodies of drowned migrants. And I'm not a migrant specialist, nor did I have any intention to work on refugees or the refugee crisis, but the topic happened to me. Because when, together with my team, the Race Face ID team, we were visiting a refugee camp in Thessaloniki in Greece, I was surprised that the camp was actually pretty much every day, pretty much like a camping site with children playing or being entertained, people chatting and smoking, mobile phones being charged, until I almost stumbled over such a golden-colored first aid blanket, lying there on the track in front of me. And suddenly the sight had changed. Crusted stories unfolded in my mind, and ever since I started to ponder the work of waste and litter, the work of these material traces. And there are obvious many other examples. The orange-colored life jacket had also assumed iconic force, and I encountered a third incident of waste as I was doing fieldwork in Zarzis in Tunisia. When I was in the office of the Tunisian Association of Fisheries and standing in front of a wall covered with pictures portraying dramas at sea, I found myself staring at pictures that showed driftwood and wreckage. It was a pile of shipwreck that had been used to transport refugees, obviously. At this moment, Salah Msherik, again, the fisherman, who's also a leading figure in the association, he told me, I will take you there. I will take you to this island. The whole island is filled with driftwood, all from shipwrecks, people of ships that didn't make it to Europe. And as we finished our tour along the wall, filled with pictures, and we sat down, Salah started telling me about the countless time that he and his fishermen would return to the port after sailing out, because rather than fishing, they would end up rescuing people from drowning. He also told me about the constant bodies that they kept finding in sea for many years. Slide. You can smell the dead bodies. from 800 meters or so. It is now getting better because the Coast Guard are doing a much better job. But the number of bodies that we were seeing and the smell, it was just horrible. I can't describe the smell, just repulsive. So I want to briefly pause with these examples of waste. And maybe we could read this instance of waste allegorically as an art of meaning something other and more than what is being said. But maybe we need to see these instances of waste as sea bottles. Slide. Bottles that carry messages and that interpolate us, maybe to contact the sender. Because this is Mohsen Al-Hnidi. I met him during my fieldwork because I heard that he had been collecting waste at the beaches of Zarzis, and especially litter that was related to migrants. He called himself eco-activist, but he is much more. He is notably an artist. Because he had been collecting so much stuff, I asked him, so do you have any hierarchy between the things that are here? Is there anything more important than the other? He looked at me and his answer came promptly. These are all sea bottles. They carry messages and lives in them. I need to take them very seriously, all of them, not all the time, but sometimes. So earlier I indicated that in this project I want to broaden the notion of forensics by attending to unusual actors in the management and identification of bodies. But I want to push the notion of forensic a bit further, namely beyond the usual understanding of an objective approach to material traces that are aimed at bringing evidence to the forum, and to put it in the word of A.L. Weisman. Especially dealing with objects such as waste, I want to propose to see forensic as an art of paying attention. Slide. Paying attention is precisely an art, so we learn from Isabelle Stengers, because it is a matter of learning, a matter of cultivating and tasting as to distinguish and differentiate. Paying attention creates obligations, as it, for example, does for the fisherman. You cannot look away, but have to turn around and help. So making ourselves pay attention creates an obligation to imagine, to check, to trace. Paying attention brings into play connections between things that we are in the habit of keeping separate, and this is the point. Connections between here and there, between us and them, now and then. So to stay in a Stengerian mode, traces of the refugee crisis produce a situation. And the question is how to give the situation the power to make us think. Now, attending to the crisis, and because it is so grim, may require pausing with unassuming traces, thinking with them in order to craft a response. So let me quickly revisit the instances of waste that I have mentioned earlier. Can we mobilize this notion of forensics as an art of paying attention as to allow waste to tell a complex story about the refugee crisis, in ways that the crisis is not reduced to one problem or one thing, and to produce artistic configurations where elements and threads keep changing? In this way, the first aid blanket may tell us a story of care. Sorry, I forgot a number of slides here. So this is all artistic work of Mohsen that I introduced earlier based on this waste that he did. The next slide is then the slide that I would like to show you. So the blanket. Whether this could be an indication of care. I think I lost most of my text. I had notions there, but that's okay, no problem. Care for those who have arrived safely in Europe, and we've seen much of that. And despite the increasing xenophobia, I was actually extremely happy to see how many citizens were giving a helping hand or taking initiatives to solve problems of food and housing, etc. There are also lots of professionals that are taking care in Europe as well as outside. There are obviously also care for borders. The political, scientific, economic investment in the European borders that were cast as vulnerable cannot be overlooked, and that is work of care. The life jacket might help us to attend to economics of the crisis. These jackets are themselves part of economic exchange. They are bought in thousands upon thousands in cities in Turkey and Libya and elsewhere, and would be drifting in the sea or left on the beaches when people arrive in Europe. These obviously fold in themselves the stories of human trafficking, of contrabands using the situation to move illegal goods across borders. It also alludes us to the fact that in the slipstream of the refugee crisis, some fishermen do not go out fishing for fish, but for outboard motors, so of boats and dinghy that crashed along the way. The value of one such motor, a fisherman told me, on the market is much higher than a cargo of fish in certain places of the world. The life jacket also alerts us to prices of the European border. Think of the Turkey deal, 2 billion, but it is now a wild west out there in northern Africa where EU and individual European countries are waving with their wallets to make the authoritarian government move and control the traffic, however brutally. Slide. The driftwood, I want to suggest, can draw our attention to issues of oversight, or rather the lack of it. Obviously, and as we all know, the boats that carry way too many people on them are also of very bad quality. And as we have learned again and again, they sail off without a captain or anybody else who has knowledge about the sea. The migrants themselves don't have a clue about the journey and what is ahead, and they have often been told, and what is ahead. And they often have been told false stories, such as, you can see that light there, that's Lampedusa, and you'll be there in a minute. And they were actually lights of an oil platform or the like. In the absence of proper European responses at sea, and Italy is the only exception, and in the absence of accountability for the dangers that people face, many NGOs emerge and have started search and rescue operations, as we all know. So the driftwood also folds the persistent story of the refugee crisis, as a temporary situation, something that can be fixed if only African states would start to behave and maintain the integrity of their borders. Finally then, smell. Smell and the smell of death might alert us to the lack of institutional responsibility. In Europe, the refugee crisis is cast in simplistic ways, distinguishing between genuine refugees who fled war or other difficult situations and might have a right to be here, and those economic migrants who should not have been here in the first place and are stupid to take those risks. Hence the lack of accountability for the dead, the paucity of monitoring the numbers of drowned people, as well as the lack for political support to help bury people properly, let alone identify them. It's really very, very hard to get a bit of money for a proper cemetery in the south of Tunisia, as I have experienced. Smell also helps to attend to the historic situation that is simultaneously contemporary, namely the history of colonialism, racism, and unequal relations. These are stories of, for example, Spain overfishing African waters, leaving local fishers without an income. These are also stories of Europe shutting its border, making trade from Africa to Europe virtually impossible, as well as stories, one could say, of racialized and biased visa systems, a system that is criminalizing and racializing African and Muslim migrants. Slide. No slide. There should have been a text, but it's gone. Attending to material traces, attending to waste, and approaching it forensically. I have here mostly focused on stories and threads of stories that are more or less obvious to you. But forensics as an art of paying attention might help us to produce different kinds of scenarios, different stories, and responses to this situation that we call the refugee crisis. It could help us to remember the dead, to not situate them in an elsewhere, but to draw them in and make them part of the common, make them member of the situations that we are all in one way or the other. Thank you.
It's It's a great pleasure. It's an honor to be a part of this panel today, and I want to thank Lucy for organizing it. I suspect, like most of us, I approach tonight's topic from many different vantage points, professional and personal. But let me make my way forward by starting with my current research. I'm going to do this super quick in about 30 seconds because my point today is not to present this work, but to share some reflections that stem from it. I'm finishing a book on the topic of sexual health. It's an investigation of how a modern conception of sexual health emerged and proliferated, how topics related to sexuality and health have come to be entangled in particular ways, how sexual health is operationalized and measured, how sexual health is optimized, how sexual health governance operates, how sexual health becomes politically contested terrain. But when I began writing the book, I did not fully understand that political developments would bring questions of both sexuality and health to the forefront in ways both large and small, overt and less obvious, new and old, and sometimes very peculiar. What I want to emphasize is that it's not simply the case that political developments of the past year hold implications for specific health and sexuality related issues, though of course they do, and I'll refer to a number of them as I proceed. More profoundly, and this will be my contribution to the idea of reframing the threat that Lucy has put forward, I think the point is that present-day modes of understanding matters of both sexuality and health are being made central to the constitution of the political in ways that demand analysis. For example, and to put the issue somewhat starkly, I find myself asking what it means to study sexual health at a time when the president of my country is known to have boasted of committing sexual assault, and of course was elected despite such boasting. While it's important to consider how the politics of sexuality are being affected by the current state of affairs, and to examine the set of issues that we might readily classify as reflecting the politicization of sexuality, it's equally necessary to examine how that quote-unquote state of affairs has itself been shaped profoundly by particular understandings of sexuality, or what we might call the sexualization of the political. Consider, for example, the claim by White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders that when the president tweeted his ban on transgender soldiers serving in the US military, he did so because he, quote, came to the conclusion that it erodes military readiness and unit cohesion, unquote. The code words of military readiness and unit cohesion, the very same ones used in the past to contest or forestall the inclusion of gay men and lesbians in the US military, and before that, women, and before that, African Americans, invoke a sexualized and heterosexualized image of masculinist potency, a kind of quote-unquote readiness that might be rendered impotent by the inclusion of anyone too queer or too other. While critics of the presence of transgender people in the military also make much of the supposed costs of their care, these critics, as far as I know, are unbothered by the fact that the US military currently spends $84 million annually on erectile dysfunction medications, which, as numerous commentators have observed, turns out to be about 10 times the amount accounted for by gender-affirming medical care for transgender troops. The image of sexual health connoted by Viagra, technologically mediated but still primordially phallocentric, not to mention generally white, signifies readiness in a way that apparently aligns happily with the conservative vision of the military and societal ideal. Somewhat analogously, while it's important to consider how the politics of health are being affected by the current state of affairs, and once again the examples are many and significant, it's equally necessary to examine how that quote-unquote state of affairs has itself been shaped profoundly by particular understandings of health and illness. Think, for example, of how narratives about the opioid crisis in the United States and about the declining life expectancy of the white working class serve to provide an interpretive frame that told what was certainly an important story about that group's real and legitimate suffering, but also might be said to have papered over the simultaneous causal contributions made to populist reaction by racial resentments, xenophobia, and other invidious sentiments exploited with pernicious effects that we continue to see borne out on the streets of US cities. So I think we confront a set of broadly epistemological questions concerning how different groups in society come to know both health and sexuality, epistemological questions that are central to the unfolding of modern political life more generally. And I think that STS has a potentially important role to play in charting that epistemic and political terrain. With regard to sexuality, it seems to me that the old Foucauldian point about the productivity of sexual discourses, what Foucault called the critique of the repressive hypothesis, is as relevant as ever. When the forces of reaction take the helm, it's an easy intellectual reflex to assume that the effect on sexuality is one of silencing and suppression. And often we see the quote-unquote threat framed in those terms. But as Foucault explained some time ago, while the point is not that sexuality isn't ever silenced, such silencing functions as just one discursive possibility within the many modes by which sexuality is, often quite verbosely, set in motion and endowed with powerful performative effects. Consider, for example, that just 3 days after the inauguration, Trump's administration instituted an enhanced version of what is known informally as the global gag rule. The name itself could not better suggest silencing. This policy significantly expanded the previous so-called Mexico City policy and requires foreign non-governmental organizations receiving U.S. global health assistance to certify not only that they don't use U.S. funds, but furthermore that they don't even use non-U.S. funds to provide abortion services, counsel patients about the option of abortion, or advocate for the liberalization of abortion laws. So while the gag rule requires that things not be said or done with regard to sexuality, gender, reproductive rights, and health, it does so, as Foucault would have it, in the loudest possible voice, and its echoes help to establish the broader parameters of global politics. I would extend this point to the many instances of what we could call agnotological inquiry, the study of what comes to not be known. If we think, for example, about the recent attempted elimination of LGBT-related questions from federal health surveys in the United States, or the canceling of a Centers for Disease Control conference on the health of queer youth, or the administration's ignoring of the advice of its own HIV/AIDS Advisory Council, it's useful as a starting point to read these as agnotological episodes, that is, as instances of the non-production or non-circulation of knowledge relevant to sexuality and health. Yet, I think just as important as the knowledge that doesn't get generated or shared are the downstream effects, the performative effects of declaring such knowledge off limits. And this is where I think we can go further, to reframe the analysis of silencing to show how agnotological processes rebound and resound. Of course, the recognition that an injunction to not speak itself speaks volumes perhaps should come as no surprise in the case of an administration chronically beset by, and in some ways defined by, the problem of internal leakers. I think an STS-inflected analysis is potentially well-positioned to bring attention to the performative effects of these and other sorts of political discourses of the moment. Let me offer 2 additional modest examples. First, the infamous travel ban, the surge in deportations, and the rhetoric surrounding the curious material/symbolic construct known as the wall. These examples, of course, share the political impulse of raising the drawbridge, as well as reinforcing nativist conceptions of citizenship. As a scholar of health and biomedicine, I'm attentive to the many aspects of these policies that potentially affect people's health. These include, for example, concerns about people being deported as a result of their seeking out health services, concerns about the effects of the travel ban on those seeking medical care, and concerns about the potential impact of the ban on global medical research. But at a deeper level, STS concepts help us understand the hybrid and boundary-crossing character of the many entities, such as bodies, diseases, and information, that flow across borders. These flows render the control efforts impractical and ultimately impossible, and they endow attempts at control with potentially harmful consequences of many sorts, such as impeding efforts to prevent and treat the diseases that inevitably do cross borders. In addition, work in STS on biocitizenship and on the constitution of racial difference has contributed to the critique of ahistorical and exclusionary notions of social belonging that underlie anti-immigrant sentiment and efforts to close borders. And analyses of these sorts can help us to call attention to the pernicious effects of claiming that impermeable boundaries between societies are desirable and achievable. They can also help us respond to disease-related scare tactics, such as this article from Breitbart News. My second example takes me back to my early work on health activism. Groups such as AIDS activists innovated understandings of a particular model of political empowerment. Some of these same activists are still around and still busy and still reminding us of the work that they did. So it's interesting and disturbing to see the adoption of a discourse of quote-unquote empowerment this year by the US Department of Health and Human Services. In a news release on March 7th, HHS launched a web page highlighting, quote, administrative actions to empower patients, unquote. The webpage explained that, quote, the Department of Health and Human Services is working every day to put patients and their doctors at the center of American health care, unquote. However, what this referred to concretely was, quote, regulatory and administrative actions the department is taking to relieve the burden of the current healthcare law and support a patient-centered healthcare system, unquote. In other words, empowerment was defined in neoliberal fashion as freeing individuals from government regulation, particularly by overturning or gutting the Affordable Care Act. The analytical point here, to return to where I started, is that we need to attend not just to how regime changes affect health politics, but also how the very understandings of health and power that circulate among groups in society help to establish the political backdrop within which regimes and changes among them come to be defined. In short, while some have suggested that STS approaches fall flat in the face of current political developments, or perhaps even indirectly have contributed to so-called post-truth politics, I would reject those characterizations as mistaken. I would insist instead that we have plenty to offer, plenty of work to do. For example, as I've suggested today, by critically examining how the knowing of health and sexuality shapes the political, that is, how the domain of the political as an epistemic object becomes sexualized and healthicized. However, I don't want to miss the opportunity to suggest that carrying out that work requires STS scholars to focus their energies not only on topics such as health, that have been part of the bread and butter of STS scholarship for some time now, but also topics like sexuality that have only recently begun to receive the attention they deserve. Thank you.
Rather than trying to achieve geopolitical stability, as the counter-communist state attempted during the Cold War, counterterror assumes an ever-emerging, constantly transforming planetary condition, one subject to both surprise and moments of fundamental change. Thus, the past does not help one understand the future in this modality, because the future is considered to be radically emergent. An expert focus on the kind of danger that has never existed before, and thus can only be intuited, drives the most dangerous aspects of the counterterror state apparatus. As I argued in the theater of operations, this comes together in the highly charged figure of the terrorist with the WMD, a phantasmatic figuration of an enemy that cannot be reasoned with, that has access to ultimate destructive power and plans to use it. This figure is also an empty category that can address a wide range of potentials, nation states, groups, individuals, to be sure, but in practice simply often mirrors the fears, the prejudices, and the conventions of the moment. This effort to preempt this figure has generated vast new sets of experts, technologies, and forms of violence since 2001, including such radical configurations as drone killing, torture, cyber war, and invasion. And by assuming an always more dangerous world, a counterterror apparatus sets up an expert competition across security agencies to identify which threats are the most serious, which are the existential ones that require priority over all others. Threat, as institutionalized by counterterror reasoning, I would argue, constitutes a commitment to worst-case thinking, as well as an effort to achieve maximal affective mobilization among experts in the first case. Thus, the counter-terror state engages the future itself as an exclusively negative terrain, one in which the nightmares of security experts compete for relevance across state, federal, and defense agencies. Brian Masumi has called this moment the entry into a threatogenic world, which means historical evidence and facts can now be rendered secondary concerns to affective states. And indeed, this is coded nicely into the very concept of a war on terror. For how can a basic emotional state ever be removed from the human condition? When can the threat of feeling terrorized be eliminated? For a quick sketch of what this looks like today, I wanted to show you a May 2017 report, just a table of contents from it actually, from the Director of National Intelligence offering a worldwide threat assessment coming from the combined 17 US intelligence agencies. And if you take just a gander here at the table of contents, you'll see that the dangers are technological innovation, terrorism, crime, resource depletion, forced migration, as well as a host of nation-state problematics from literally every corner of the world. The US threat domain here becomes literally the entire planet. This 32-page document, one of many such documents generated across defense departments every year, is a snapshot also of US ambitions and can be read as a figuration of what imperialism looks like in a post-colonial era. There are a host of STS questions embedded in each of these categories, linking concerns about technology to data analytics and predictive capabilities to on-the-ground intelligence, global communications, as well as assessment of climate change, local politics, crime, et cetera, But there's also a dangerous official invitation here to take these threats as the necessary ones, to embrace this kind of monumental global analytic and to use the power of multidisciplinary expertise on behalf of a US state apparatus, to assume the reality not only of a unipolar world, but of a US state that can operate efficiently at this kind of scale. So here I think the US security state reveals something important about the current logics of threat as a form of pure futurity. First, threat mobilizes a combination of imagination and affect devoted to negative potentials. But since not all objects and dangers rise to the level of official concern, the imaginaries here, as well as the affects supporting them, have specific histories. They are cultural formations that are built up over years of expert practice across games, scenarios, mistakes, successes, and intuitions and desires. Affects and imaginations are, I think, important STS objects to analyze alongside built infrastructures, technologies, and policies. 2, threat is an expansionary domain, one that colonizes the future and pulls thinking towards worst-case scenarios that have not yet happened. Thus, this kind of thinking devalues current conditions in favor of potentially terrifying future ones, creating a strange new political economy of real versus imagined violences. And 3, the form of threat assessment adopted by the counterterror apparatus strives for ultimate scale while also being at odds with existing planetary dangers, most notably climate change. This is because planetary problems require a post-national security commitment to a global commons or a species community, a multi-species community, creating a contradiction for national security itself. Thus, it's possible for counterterror experts to proliferate visions of future endangerment that only function as a recruitment to increasing negative affect. They do not necessarily mobilize a practical response to these problems, as the planetary scale remains out of reach. So for all these reasons, I want to suggest today that threat assessment as a contemporary mode of anticipatory knowledge has an inherent flaw, one that takes a reasonable act of situational awareness and precautionary thinking and turns it into a weaponized project, enabling a permanent war posture and massive forms of misrecognition. Threat assessment can be mobilized and has been mobilized since 2001 by US authorities to divert attention from existing forms of violence in favor of trying to predict and prevent potential future ones. Thus, national security threat assessments naturalize a set of potentials as likely realities and creates a structure whereby a vast range of lived violent conditions become secondary to imagined existential ones. So threat in our moment can be an official project that is both wildly imaginative and strangely non-attentive, one that articulates a principle of future protection while diverting both urgency and resources from existing conditions. And think just for a moment of all the accruing forms of violence and endangerment that do not rise to national security concerns in our moment. Clean air and water, inequality and racialized violence, financial instability, climate change, to name just a few. And the list is actually quite long, detailing existing exposures, long-standing structural violences, settler-colonial relations, racism and class warfare, each of which details a lived reality. So this deployment of the future to forget all that and to focus on not yet existing conditions is the thing I'm trying to unpack. Much of the strange focus on the not yet existing violence can be derived from one sentence, really just one word, from the authorization of force that Congress signed on September 18th, 2001. I don't know, can you even read this? If you look at the arrows, you'll see that the key passage in which Congress not only authorizes forces against those nations, organizations, or persons involved in the 9/11 attacks, but also, quote, to prevent any future acts of international terrorism, unquote. This last phrase is one of the most important authorizations in U.S. history. Sorry, I knocked the camera over with that.
Forceful point.
I'll say it again for the camera. This last phrase is one of the most important legal authorizations in U.S. history, as it does not identify a specific enemy, but focuses on preventing anything the president deems to be terrorist. Indeed, emergency exercises have adopted the phrase universal adversary as the name of this threatening figure, formally removing it of all content except the capacity for mass violence. The 2001 authorization of force remains active to this day, long after the invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, the killing of the top leadership of Al-Qaeda, and authorize a vast set of military actions, both acknowledged and covert, across a range of nation states. Indeed, the question of the future activates threat assessment as a primary focus of security state power today. The Congressional Research Service documented 30 public presidential evocations of this 2001 authorization of force in recent years, and I've got some of the information on that on the screen. The author is linking an astonishingly wide range of states, domains, objects, and processes under urgent conditions. The authorization is also the authority for a wide range of classified actions around the world. It is, in essence, a radical new social contract, but one that is not subject to public review and currently has no end date. In a very real sense, the state of emergency declared on September 18th continues to this moment. Counterterror threat assessments authorized in this manner have, according to the Cost of War Project, resulted in some 370,000 deaths, 7.6 million refugees since 2001, and cost to date something like $5 trillion. So threat assessments matter. The cataclysmic future as an object of imagination and intervention currently engages U.S. military forces, intelligence agencies, the Centers for Disease Control, the FBI, drug enforcement, and a host of other organizations now attempting to work on ultimate scale. In 2016, U.S. Special Forces were deployed to no less than 138 countries, responding, as the U.S. Special Operations Command put it, to, quote, a varied and evolving threat environment. If this were not enough, U.S. threat assessments are not even bound to the Earth anymore. Earlier this year, NASA created the first of its kind, a singular planetary defense officer charged with responding to potential asteroids and satellite collisions. So really just one guy. While other plans for adding a Space Corps to the armed services are gaining traction in Congress. This is David Vine's, anthropologist David Vine's kind of map of the scale of U.S. military basing around the world. Supported by perhaps 800 global military bases and by 17 intelligence agencies working across space, air, land, water, and cyberspace, the U.S. has built an unprecedented apparatus to assess a threatening future and try to counter it. U.S. national security in this way exhibits a strange combination of absolute pessimism about the future and absolute optimism about the ability to intervene into it. And so the US spends about $1 trillion a year now, all told, on defense across the Defense Department, Homeland Security, and other agencies. Yet I would venture that very few feel secured by this investment. Threat assessment, nonetheless, has become a central mechanism of military capitalism, a force which can be self-propelling as national policy and is now essential for permanent war. So our great age of threat assessment is also one that has proliferated dangers in all directions. The turn away from welfare security in favor of militarization since the end of the Cold War amplifies the structures of insecurity for all concerns, adding to feelings of the material reality of endangerment. People are more secure today for many reasons, but let me underscore two that are related to threat assessments. The first is the decline of welfare state security commitments to building a safer and more supported everyday life, leaves people in more vulnerable conditions. And two, the shifting physical conditions for life on Earth as industrial effects and global warming unfold are literally putting more pressure on all organisms. Anthropogenic activities are shifting the relationship of Earth systems and increasingly exceeding the risk-based understanding for future environmental danger. That is, the combination of historical data and probability calculation that enables actuarial tables for things like insurance is breaking down due to novel conditions emerging. Cities, of course, are flooding with increasing regularity, as we're seeing terrifyingly this week, alongside intensifying droughts and fires and heat waves. Thus, the conditions for living on planet Earth are changing in substantial ways that exceed existing registers of anticipated scale. However, there's very little in that $1 trillion US defense budget that address these shifting conditions, but much that seeks to acknowledge the more precarious world that is emerging because of them in favor of more militarism. Put more starkly, the Department of Defense now calls climate change a force multiplier, one that makes every regional dynamic more fraught, even as multiple counter-terror presidential regimes since 2001 have officially rejected the findings of environmental science. So how should we approach this concept of threat at our historical moment, when the counter-terror apparatus has deployed the potentially catastrophic future on such a massive and ferocious scale, while also narrowly limiting the sources or the existing forms of that dangerous future? Existing police violence is not a threat, but a potential future asteroid strike is. Poisoned urban water is not urgent, but the not yet existing biochemical weapon is. A destabilizing climate system is a worry, but the state that does not have a nuclear weapon and might is an urgent concern. One important move here would be to recover the concepts that have been rendered officially unthinkable under the logics of counterterror. In current US national security discourse, peace is a word that has been all but forgotten, as has disarmament, and non-proliferation is frequently undermined as weak policy instead of a collective form of future-making. Indeed, even war has been largely eliminated from public discourse and simply renamed. The actions of the US state since 2001 that I listed under the authorization of force are now officially known as overseas contingency operations, an explicit rhetorical effort to normalize global conflict and transform it into a form of just simple background noise, a non-exceptional state of affairs, even if a hyper-violent one. A society that cannot engage the possibility of peace or consider a reduction in arms is by definition a more threatening one, a more violent one. The foundational violences of racism, poverty, war, and environmental destruction, and today I think we also need to add democracy reduction techniques, are material felt conditions that both link and divide populations in observable ways. In other words, the disaster is not in the future. It's already here, already unfolding on a broad range of temporalities and domains, and has been here for some time. Thus, how might we answer our panel's important question about threat, both as STS scholars and in light of the past 16 years of war on terror threat assessments? Well, I think anticipatory knowledge is an increasingly powerful expert domain with multiple methodological modalities, algorithmic, scenario-driven, risk-based, and so on. But we can serve an important social role in being attentive to the embedded values, the silent positions, and the material consequences of the resulting threat assessments, asking directly, why and when existing violence does not have the same affective pull as potentials and possibilities. We can also be cautious of the affective politics of threat mobilization, seeing in any given assessment a naturalized depiction of whose future threat matters, and implicitly, whose does not. Thanks.
Okay, well, that was exactly what I'd hoped it would be, even though I had no idea that it would be what it was. And I think the way that the close that Joe gave us looped back on the opening that Kim gave us, reminding us that for many, the apocalypse has long already been over. Or with us, and for others of us, this kind of endlessly anticipatory future is actually obscuring the already existing modes of concern that we should be attending to. So I think, again, both remembering and looking laterally are really important strategies. Of course, one of my aspirations was that this was going to be a session that would provide all sorts of openings for discussion, and that was clearly a fantasy and not surprising. So I think, given that we are technically at the end of our time and there are drinks outside, that we should retire to the reception. Very importantly, you were supposed to be given drinks tickets with your registration, and as I understand it, there was an omission of that. So as you leave, people will be handing out drinks tickets, so be sure that you collect those. And obviously, we all need them very much at this point. So thank you very much, and we'll see you out there.